Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Risa. Pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Leah, also she, her.
And we are the co-organizers of this roundtable. We're going to provide a brief overview of why we're gathering and how we plan to use our time together. And as a quick reminder to all, this event is being recorded for online participants who we are happy to welcome as well. So this roundtable wishes to mark the 1990s as a generative moment for the development of reproductive politics frameworks. In 1994, 12 Black women gathered in Chicago to name and frame reproductive justice, a movement for social change based on the expertise of interlocking oppressions of patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, that was marginalized in mainstream white feminism that was organizing around reproductive rights. Within the field of anthropology, the 1991 publication of the Politics of Reproduction annual review article by Faye Ginsburg and Raina Rapp argued for bringing reproduction to the center of social theory by foregrounding the social and political forces that shape and are shaped by reproduction.
Faye and Raina's provocation was immensely important to our discipline because reproduction is not intrinsically relevant to politics, and yet our reproductive lives, social stories, and bodily materials have been diversely enrolled in political projects across place and time. As Sarah Franklin puts it, reproduction is itself a means of producing other things, other relationships, other values, or other identities. And while this fact is often obscured, feminist scholars and activists have focused on understanding where and how reproduction becomes politicized and with what effects. This roundtable gathers some of the many scholars who have responded robustly to this call and who have and are transforming anthropological understandings about major global forces that animate our worlds. In addition to those sitting around this table, we recognize many of you in the audience as part of this tradition and welcome new faces to join us in this conversation.
We wish to acknowledge that we gather in a particular place and time that has a lot to teach us about reproductive politics. We meet in Takaranto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Settler colonialism undermines Indigenous peoples' lands, lives, and lifeways, by which we mean people's ability to reproduce themselves, as well as their traditions and heritage.
We're having this conversation on reproductive politics as the lives of many unfold amidst unimaginable horrors in Israel-Palestine. Our heart goes out to all innocent lives, some whom are friends who have died, been abducted, and are suffering in Israel, the West Bank, and in Gaza. As a person who calls Israel-Palestine home, I'm advocating for an end to all this violence and for the return of all those who have been taken hostage, those who are Israeli and those who are not, those who are children and those who are not. Specifically, I'm advocating for an end to the occupation of the West Bank, the siege of Gaza, the wars, the death, and the violations of human rights. I will continue advocating for a vision where all those who live between the sea and the Jordan River can live in peace with the dignity they deserve. Keeping Israel and Palestine in our thoughts as we discuss the simultaneous dimensions of reproductive politics, the hidden and the explicit, grim and hopeful, seems important as we delve into a discussion that links the most intimate and most public parts of life.
So we're going to start with a round of brief introductions from each of the panelists, followed by a facilitated open conversation. We're so glad you're sitting close because we really look forward to engaging with you. Each will introduce themselves, their pronouns, and describe their appearances for accessibility purposes, and then respond to these two prompts.
How did you come to feminist anthropology of reproduction? Oh, we're there. Okay, good. So after formal introductions, we will use our remaining time to deepen our discussion, and these are some additional questions that we envision inspiring conversation with our panelists and our audience. So to get us started, we welcome Professor Marcia Inhorn to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Marcia Inhorn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so pleased to be part of this incredible panel on 40 years of feminist anthropology on reproductive politics. It's an intergenerational conversation, and I'm in the elder generation, okay? But Risa and Leah of the younger generation asked us 3 questions. What conditions supported the emergence of a feminist anthropology of reproductive politics? How have feminist ethnographies of reproduction over the past 4 decades contributed to disciplinary understandings about culture, politics, and power? And what critical perspectives remain missing within this tradition and are necessary for advancing the field? And so I actually want to take us on a book journey over 40 years and show you a lot of colorful covers of the great books that we have produced. I want to address the second question on feminist ethnography. Back in 2006, I published a piece in MAQ called Defining Women's Health, a dozen messages from more than 150 ethnographies. And in the first 20 years of our feminist reproductive work, there were, to my count, 157 ethnographies, 50 from Western nations, including the seminal volumes, Contested Lives by Faye Ginsburg on abortion in the US, Raina's Women Testing the Fetus on amniocentesis in the US, Emily Martin's The Woman in the Body, the major analysis of reproduction in America, Robbie Davis Floyd's Birth is an American Rite of Passage on childbirth in the US, and Sarah Franklin's Embodied Progress on the emergence of IVF in the UK. 57 of these books were from non-Western nations, including Nancy Shepherd Hughes's Death Without Weeping about motherhood and child survival and death in Brazil, Margaret Locke's Encounters with Aging about menopause in North America and something called Konenki in Japan, Cecilia Van Hollen's Birth on the Threshold about birthing in India, Rhoda Kanana's book called Birthing the Nation about Palestinian women and their reproduction in the nation of Israel, and my book, Quest for Conception, about infertility and IVF in Egypt. And then 50 were ethnographic edited volumes, including the seminal Conceiving the New World Order by Faye and Raina, Robbie Davis Floyd's Childbirthing Authoritative Knowledge, Sarah Franklin's Reproducing Reproduction, Susan Greenhalgh's Situating Fertility, and my Infertility Around the Globe. Now, in that article, I said there are a dozen messages we should be looking at as feminist anthropologists. The first is that women really don't do the defining of their own health. It's often in the hands of major organizations like the NIH and WHO. Women are still reproductively essentialized. We're seen as wives, mothers, reproducers in the field of OBGYN, the big initiatives like safe motherhood and child survival. Women's bodies are culturally constructed. It varies from place to place, but bodies can be read as social texts, and they can be disciplined and controlled, as we saw in the famous book, The Woman in the Body. Women's lives are increasingly biomedicalized. There's a lot of pathologization that goes on, and clearly the pharmaceuticalization of women's reproductive lives from menarche to menopause. Biomedical hegemony has asserted itself in women's reproductive lives. We see this in the childbirth move from home to hospital and the massive increase in cesarean deliveries. But women produce health too, and we need to recognize women as healers, as clinicians, and as caretakers. The resurgence of traditional midwifery, and Donna Ian Davis's book really talks about the doula movement that is arising in the world. Yet patriarchy is health demoting. There's still so much gender oppression and its ill health effects around the world, including violence against girls and women, and the growing scholarship on obstetric violence. The intersectionality of race, class, gender, and other forms of oppression in women's health really emerged in the first 20 years, and we have wonderful scholarship now on reproductive racism and the health disparities affecting women in minority groups. The state intervenes in women's health in so many ways, as we know in the US, restriction on abortion access, contraception in some places, assisted reproductive technologies in other places. So women's health, reproductive health, is the site of politics, of political struggle, overt, covert, micro and macro struggle. A great example is the recent move from the 1 to 3 child policy in China. And all of this is within what Arthur Kleinman called local moral worlds. You know, people are thinking about what is at stake in their lives. It's often religiously based sense of morality. And we see this in, the right to life, the abortion struggles. And basically, the Catholic Church still bans all reproductive technologies. So it's really important to understand women's subjectivities in the midst of all of these issues. Really, I think of the profundity and poignancy of women's reproductive lives, and it's really what we do as feminist ethnographers. We have this person-centered approach to understanding women's reproduction. Now, part 2, the next 20 years, There are at least 150 more feminist ethnographies of reproduction that have been published, and I'm happy to be part of a series at Berghahn Books called Fertility, Reproduction, and Sexuality, Social and Cultural Perspectives, which was founded by Soraya Tremaine at Oxford. And we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of this series in January at the Royal Anthropological Institute in London, because there are 55 books published in the last 20 years. And just to show you a few of them, the most recent is by Chia-Ling Wu on making multiple babies, about the high-order multiple births that happen often in assisted reproduction. Soraya's Inconceivable Iran, about the reproductive politics in that very contested nation of Iran. My recent volume with Nancy Smith Hefner called Waithood, about the global delays in marriage and childbearing occurring around the world. A wonderful ethnography from India on the IVF, world of IVF, called Conceptions by Adi Bharadwaj. And Nicole Berry's wonderful book called Unsafe Motherhood, about Mayan women and all the challenges they face in Guatemala in reproduction. Now, we have a new generation of ethnographies from people on this stage. Ethnographies from the last decade, beginning with Liz Roberts' God's Laboratory, which is about IVF in Ecuador, Elise Andaya's Conceiving Cuba, about reproductive politics in that post-Soviet nation, Donna Ein Davis's Reproductive Injustice, about racism and how it affects African American women's pregnancy, their birth outcomes, their children in the NICU, and Elise Singer's Lawful Sins, about abortion and abortion politics in Mexico. And then there's the newest generation of ethnographies from this year, Danya Glabau's Food Allergy Advocacy, about parenting children with food allergies in an increasingly complex food world. Risa's Conceiving Christian America, which is about embryo adoption in the evangelical movement in this country. Leah's The State of Desire, about reproductive politics in Israel. And I'm not in the newest generation, but I do have a book this year called Motherhood on Ice, which is about egg freezing in the US. And so I want to say just something about my area, assisted reproductive technologies, and what's happened. Reina and a French colleague, Séverine Mathieu, did a special issue called Reprotech in France and the United States, and I published a piece in that called Where Has the Quest for Conception Taken Us? Lessons from Anthropology and Sociology. And I argued that the quest for conception for people who are searching or are infertile and searching for ARTs or want to have children now entails 7 different directions. The first being technological quests. Sarah Franklin's book, Biological Relatives, really shows how IVF was a platform technology for so many other technologies that have arisen, all the way up to stem cell technologies. Masculine quests. Men are reproducers. We always forget about them, but men have reproductive issues. They use reproductive technologies, as seen as in Io Wahlberg's Good Quality, about sperm banking in China, and my own book called The New Arab Man. I talk about male infertility and men's turn to ICSI in the Middle East. Unfortunately, stratified reproduction lives on, and these quests are increasingly stratified, as shown in Ann Bell's book, Misconception, about how infertility and access to treatment is really divided by social class in the US. These quests are transnational. People are moving, body parts are moving, surrogates are moving, clinicians are moving. It's a moving transnational world, as shown in Andrea Whitaker's book on surrogacy as a disruptive industry in Southeast Asia. And the quests are increasingly selective. People making decisions about what kinds of children to bring in the world, as shown in the haunting book called Haunting Images by Tina Gameltoft, about the use of ultrasound and very late trimester abortions in Vietnam. And these quests are very moral. Religion does matter in reproduction, as shown in Ben Caston's book called Making Bodies Kosher, The Politics of Reproduction Among Ultra-Orthodox Jews in England. And extended quests. Egg freezing has extended fertility, made it extendable by preserving eggs, but these technologies are being extended into different populations, to trans people, to LGBT communities, but Krista Craven's wonderful book shows that there's so many challenges still to family making among LGBT people. So the future of reproduction is here and now. We need more feminist reproductive anthropologists to be part of these futures. We have young scholars on the stage, and I hope there are PhD students in the audience who are getting ready to take part in this conversation. And that's what I have to say, and I thank you for your attention.
Good morning. I'm Raina Rapp, a short white woman with a lot of gray hair and many layers of gray clothing. Before we get started, Faye and I will co-introduce ourselves so then we don't have to interrupt again. Over to you.
Yeah. So I'm Faye Ginsberg. I'm taller than Raina. I have short brown hair, and I'm older than Risa and Leah. We want to thanks. So, and wearing plaid pants because it's Toronto, and a black shirt. I also just want to mention that I'm wearing a red pin that is a beautiful beaded work in the shape of a women's dress, and it's actually worn by a lot of people in Canada and also in the U.S. these days, part of a campaign to bring back missing and murdered Indigenous women in particular. So I just want to acknowledge that while we're up here. Okay, so we're going to
Co-read.
Yes, we're going to co-read, and we're going to be split into two parts. It's very exciting. Okay.
Many splits here. Thanks so much to Risa and Leah for the organizing of this exciting roundtable and for their vision drawing together such a great group of scholars. We're delighted and honored to be part of this 40-year intergenerational conversation on feminist anthropology and reproductive politics. At the same time, we were a bit nervous to be seen as part of the ancestral lineage. Instead, we decided we'd much rather be doulas. To quote the American Pregnancy Association page's description of this profession, quote, "A doula's purpose is to help women have a safe, memorable, and empowering birthing experience." In this case, all of the fantastic ideas and empirical research that are being birthed that have emerged since we first coined the term, the politics of reproduction. In this difficult time, the work represented on the stage and in this audience gives us hope for the future with such important projects opening up in new directions. As anthropologists who have been anchored first in feminist and later disability studies, we have a longstanding commitment to reflexivity, encouraging us to theorize our own experiences. So here it goes. Our collaborative research and writing has been since the 1980s, based on an enduring friendship and lively academic partnership.
Thank you. I just also want to acknowledge our fabulous ASL interpreter. We started working together in the 1980s because of our shared interest in women's experiences of reproduction, starting with the battles over abortion clinics following the Roe v. Wade decision that shaped my first field work. Raina was outside reader on my dissertation, and my book, Contested Lives. Here we go. The rise of late 20th century reproductive technologies propelled Raina to study the brave new world of reproduction through the lens of genetic testing, analyzed in Testing Women, Testing the Fetus, which we see on the screen here. Unsurprisingly, ARTs and abortion remain sites of constant contestation in American cultural and political life. In 1991, our first co-authored article on the politics of reproduction, with that title, appeared in the Annual Review of Anthropology, followed that same year by a Wenner-Gren conference that we organized. And a resulting edited volume, Conceiving the New World Order, The Global Politics of Reproduction. We just had to, it took us a long time. It took us a while to find that picture, but we were determined. Okay, stratified reproduction, that is already was mentioned so nicely in Marcia's great talk, is a central concept guiding, I think, all of us to think comparatively and intersectionally about the cultural hierarchies and power relations enabling and disrupting women's control over their bodies, sexuality, pregnancy, and children's lives in diverse locations across the globe. And we, that concept was one of the big ideas that came out of that conference.
And of course, it is owed to Shelley Collin, who was then doing her work on reproduction in the Caribbean and in New York as well. The roots of our collaboration grew deeper and increasingly interdependent when a pregnant Faye served as my research subject. I was then in the middle of my study of women's experiences and decision-making around amniocentesis, genetic testing, and the possibility of having or aborting an atypical fetus. With a transducer on her belly, Faye cracked jokes about not wanting to bond with the screened fetus while I took notes, and an annoyed and puzzled radiologist turned to us and asked, "Who are you girls anyway?" It is an enduring irony of our longstanding research and writing partnership that when I asked Faye back in 1988, when there were only a limited number of genetic tests available, how she felt about the subject, about being the subject of such a test, she replied, well, now I know my fetus doesn't have 3 things wrong with it, and for the rest, we'll see.
When my daughter Samantha, or Sam, was born a few months later, she had mysterious and life-threatening symptoms that landed us in the hospital for months on what medical anthropologists call the diagnostic odyssey. At 6 months, Sam was diagnosed with a very rare autosomal recessive degenerative Ashkenazi Jewish genetic disorder. A lot of adjectives there. Familial dysautonomia, or FD. From that point on, the two of us have been in constant entangled conversation regarding the gaps between existential, cultural, religious, and biomedical understandings of what life with a difference or disability is all about. 8 years later, Raina's second child, Teo, was diagnosed with significant learning disabilities. Our children ended up going to the same special ed, in quotes, primary and middle schools, and we kept the conversation going, including at frequent family gatherings and in the family, thank you, and in the waiting room at the ICU and all kinds of locations. As close friends and longtime research partners, we were engrossed in constant discussion as we tried to make sense of our experiences. The feminist motto, "The personal is political," was our North Star.
Okay, we should turn this off.
Yeah, and now we will go to there. Okay, she'll take care of that. Okay, the second half is coming up.
Later.
Later.
But we have to get rid of this so that other people can go. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Good. Hello. Thank you. Call and response. I want to thank Risa and Leah for putting together this really thoughtful panel, being up here with all of these amazing people. I also want to begin by honoring the land on which we stand and honoring the lives that are decimated by imperialism, colonialism, enslavement, and genocide. As the granddaughter of domestic workers, janitors, and porters, I also want to thank the people who set up and clean up after we depart, that hidden labor, that unseen labor that we so often fail to acknowledge. And I want to thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Keisha. And I want to thank Keisha also. All right, next. So I am Donna Ayin Davis, and my entree into the area of reproduction was not at all academic. I am a beneficiary of Roe v. Wade. In the 1990s, I began working with NARAL New York, of which I became co-president. I started working with the incredible Rosalind Paczewski, directing internships for the Reproductive Rights Education Project at Hunter College. And that brought me into a circle of activists like Vernice Miller, Loretta Ross, and Marlene Gerber-Fried, who ran the Civil Liberties Public Policy Conference at Hampshire College. One of the most influential people, though, has been Toni Bond, who was one of the 12 Black women who were the founding mothers of reproductive justice. And she invited me to work with the National Network of Abortion Funds. I also worked with the National Institute of Reproductive Health and now work with Collective Power, formerly known as CLIP. But after about 10 years being away from reproductive rights, justice, freedom, I was pulled into the orbit of anthropology of reproduction when Naja Suleiman, derisively known as Octomom, was on the receiving end of public racialized and classist denigration. I wrote about her in an article called The Politics of Reproduction. I think it's called The Startling Case of Naja Suleiman. And then just after that article was published in about 2009, I began a journey in medical anthropology with the support of Vanessa Agar-Jones, Monica Casper, Risa Cromer, Barbara Katz-Rothman, Annie Menzel, Leith Mullings, Raina Rapp, and Natalie Valdez. focusing on issues of racism, pregnancy, and premature birth. My lessons were long, because although I had been trained by 3 medical anthropologists, Leith Mullings, Shirley Lindenbaum, and Ida Susser, I had not centered that subfield. Okay, next. My thinking on reproduction, race, and racism was deeply influenced by 2 texts. One is it's blurry, they're blurry, I apologize for that. Conceiving the New World Order, which I feel like I should get a new copy because it's so dog-eared, and I've written on almost every page. And also Stress and Resilience. Since that time, I've worked alongside and in solidarity with some really powerful people transnationally to explore anti-Black racism and reproduction. And so, with Leith Mullings whispering in my ear, I directed my attention to transnational movements and around reproduction. And this past summer, I was super fortunate to co-host the first ever convening of international scholars from France, Portugal, Italy, Mayotte, South Africa, Australia, Amsterdam, Brazil, the UK, and Switzerland, along with Black birth workers from Spain, France, the UK, and the US and Amsterdam to talk about race, racism, and reproductive health. And in keeping with Leith Mullings' point that we need to do our anti-racist and social justice organizing transnationally and engage in collaborations, we need to do so to facilitate making the anthropology of reproduction a vibrant space for both mentoring and working alongside those who embrace justice, and an opportunity to cite people who are not always part of the canon. And some of the scholars and birth workers who are at various stages of their careers doing feminist work on the anthropology of reproduction and racism, I have come to know over the last 2 years include, next slide please, Zakia Ahmed from Mayotte, Princess Banda, who's a PhD student at the University of Oxford, and who examines Black feminist scholarship and methodologies and racial health disparities. Caroline Bazambaza of the London School of Economics, who's a doula and an anthropology student working on the medicalization of birth and the disproportionate levels of maternal mortality among Black women in the UK. Emmanuel Frias-Goes from the Instituto de Saúde Coletiva Universidade Federal da Bahia, Brazil, working on abortion. Patricia Hamilton, who's at the University of York, whose work explores Black mothers' engagement with attachment parenting. Alana Hilberg-Proctor at the University of Amsterdam, who examines how race and ethnicity appear in biomedical research. Anna Horn, who is also a doula and a student at UCL, studying group antenatal care in South Africa and the UK. And the Fua Pra of the University of Johannesburg, who's a medical anthropologist whose scholarly work examines intercontinental African migration politics, critical race theory of the South, adolescent and childhood studies, and studies the embodiment of sexuality, pregnancy, and birthing. And I simply name these feminist scholars and activists as anthropologists of reproduction and racism because I firmly believe that those writing about racism and anti-Black racism must connect to others doing that work. Collaborating and internationalizing our approach helps us to think critically about persistent racial differences in reproductive outcomes informed by transhistorical, transnational, and intersectional understandings of the constraints that impede Black women's successful reproduction over time and space. US-based academics' work has such a tremendous impact on the work of those in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and other places. And I do think it's important for us to really think about a citational praxis that lifts up their work in equal measure. Last slide, please. So I've been inspired, as you can tell, by Leith Mullings, and so I just want to conclude with this quote that serves as my North Star for the work that I want to continue doing. In the 21st century, we are still confronted by an international color line, the racialized consequences of massive impoverishment, white supremacy, and globalized racial capitalism. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Hi. My name is Nadia Naomi Mbonde. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a PhD candidate at NYU in the Department of Anthropology, which resides on Lenape land. For a visual description, I'm a relatively tall, light-skinned Black woman with red locks, brown glasses, and I'm wearing a brown and black outfit. I just want to thank the organizers of this roundtable and for everyone who's made this important conversation possible and accessible. I am indebted to the legacy of Black feminist anthropologists for whom the personal and the professional are intrinsically linked, especially in their experiences with multiple compounding forms of systemic oppression, as Dr. Donna Ayin Davis just eloquently mentioned. So how did I come to a feminist anthropology of reproduction? Let me take you back to 2018, when I trained as a birth and postpartum doula. This was the year that policymakers, the media, and the wider public noted once again the exorbitant racial disparities in maternity care and outcomes. It was the year Serena Williams almost died from medical neglect during her labor, and Beyoncé revealed that she almost died while giving birth to her twins. Emboldened to be part of the new wave of doulas to aid in reducing rates of Black maternal mortality, little did I know that I would be my first client. In 2019, I began my PhD program at NYU while pregnant. After 2 weeks of classes, I took leave for a year and almost didn't return. This is because I was experiencing severe symptoms of mania, psychosis, as well as depression and intrusive suicidal thoughts. There's limited research on the impact of mental health complications on Black maternal mortality and morbidity. Studies reveal psychiatry's inability to address Black maternal mental health, or what I call reproductive mental health, effectively for Black women, trans, and non-binary people. In the US, almost 40% of Black birthing people experience maternal mental health conditions at twice the rate of their white counterparts, but are less likely to receive treatment. Even in near-miss cases where the pregnant or postpartum person does not die, mental health-related complications can have devastating effects on the birthing person, their infants, and families. As a doula in training, I learned of the physical causes of maternal death, such as hemorrhage, embolism, cardiovascular conditions, and infection. Yet suicide and overdose, leading causes of maternal mortality, are still not commonly known. But the mind and body cannot be separated. Studies demonstrate the relationship between physical and mental health in the perinatal period. For instance, birthing people, like myself, who experienced mental health challenges before pregnancy are more likely to have complications, including hemorrhage and preterm birth, especially if mental health challenges are not addressed in prenatal care. It was only after experiencing severe mental health challenges throughout my pregnancy that I became aware of this mind-body connection. Among several afflictions, in my second trimester, I experienced mania-induced retinal detachment and emergency eye surgery under anesthesia to save my vision. Upon returning to my PhD program, I was instilled with the embodied knowledge that mental health issues are central to understanding Black maternal mortality and morbidity. As a medical anthropologist, I address an understudied and under-theorized problem, namely the siloing of mental health and reproduction. As a visual anthropologist, artist, and filmmaker, I use dance, film, photography, and digital collage to create a visual vocabulary that captures the experience of madness, disability, and altered states that cannot be expressed in words or with psychiatric labels. For instance, this image where I adorn my hair with spoons is my contribution to spoon theory, the discourse in disability studies often used by people with chronic illness to articulate how much energy they have at their disposal. You'll often hear them say, "I'm low on spoons." This image, which I call the Queen of Spoons, speaks to the inverse problem of having too many spoons and not enough uses for them, a dilemma that people who experience mania know all too well. My dissertation project explores how Black pregnant and postpartum people narrate their experiences with mental health. I believe this work can offer alternative frameworks for understanding the politics of reproduction shaping the lives of Black parents and families today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That is me, yes. Hi, my name is Elisa Ndaya. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a middle-aged, olive-skinned woman with curly, shoulder-length black hair. And first, I'd like to say how very honored I am to be invited to participate in this roundtable with such an esteemed group of scholars of reproduction. And I want to thank Risa and Leah for the invitation and to everyone involved in making this amazing event happen. So we've been asked to say a few words about how we came to the feminist anthropology of reproductive politics, and I was beyond fortunate to be mentored into the field as a graduate student at NYU in the 1990s when the field was still very new, through two of the field's pioneers, Raina Rapp and Faye Ginsberg, who are here today. In the course of searching for a dissertation topic that I felt passionate about, a process that Faye once memorably described as around the world with Elisa Ndaya, I was introduced to the anthropology of reproduction through a graduate seminar with Raina and was hooked. I went to Cuba hoping to study universal prenatal genetic testing, but through the twists and false starts typical of fieldwork, ended up instead following community-level family doctors as they cared for the pregnant people in their neighborhoods. What felt to me at the time like a personal and professional failure, I dreaded telling Raina that I was unable to write a dissertation, in fact brought me squarely into feminist conversations about care. Inspired by touchstone texts like the 1995 Conceiving the New World Order, feminist anthropologists of reproductive politics have clearly demonstrated not only that biological reproduction is inextricable from social reproduction, but how these entanglements are produced, and crucially, towards what ends. Thinking about how and why reproduction becomes a site of contestation and political activity foregrounds care and its absence as a material, political, economic, and moral activity through which we make and unmake reproductive worlds. A growing body of anthropological research explores care as a set of practices and vital politics that can, in some contexts, weave together human and more than human social bonds, what Lisa Stevenson describes as a process by which someone or something comes to matter. But analyses of care also show how institutions and individuals reproduce relations of inequality, neglect, and even violence under the guise of providing care. In my research in Cuba, I followed these social contestations, showing how pregnant women articulated their claims on the state, asserting its responsibility to care for its citizens by nurturing maternal fetal bodies, and explaining low fertility as a consequence of the state's failure to provide what they called conditions. In a very different context, as I describe in my forthcoming book, the language of care is a central idiom through which pregnant low-wage workers in New York City consider the morality of the temporal structures that shape their reproductive lives and their attempts to care for themselves and their fetuses. Their bodily and affective experiences of fatigue, stress, and frustration, and consequent evaluations about whether supervisors, employers, or doctors care about them, are central to larger interpretive frameworks through which they understand that their persons, time, and pregnancies are valued or not. These claims and complaints around care, state care, institutional care, intergenerational care, are a powerful lens onto the affective and material processes through which reproduction is stratified, to invoke Shelley Collins' hugely generative concept. In asking, what does it mean to care for human and non-human others, and this is the point at which I want to end today, feminist anthropologists concerned with reproductive politics are connecting to other forms of activism, reproductive justice, environmental justice, anti-racist, anti-poverty, anti-carceral, and decolonizing movements, among others. There are many places today that we can look to see the urgency of such alliances, fraught although they sometimes are. For me, it was brought home again at the 4S conference in Hawaii last week. The keynote, entitled On Fantasies, Broken Things, and the Redistribution of Epistemic Authority, featured recorded testimony by the Hawaiian activist U'alani Kapu to the Commission on Water Resource Management during an almost 9-hour community hearing after the devastating fire in Lahaina, Maui, the island on which my own father was born and raised in the years before Hawaii became a state or was annexed. In her fierce and grief-filled address, she denounced the history of masculinist, colonialist, and capitalist dispossession, which has diverted water from wetlands to first the sugar plantations, and now to the infinity pools of luxury developments and hotels for non-residents. Pointing to the desiccation produced by climate change and overdevelopment, she charged that powerful individuals and institutions have failed to care for the land, undermining the conditions for her 5 children and her community to dwell in fullness on the lands that they call home. At the same hearing, Kano'elani Stewart, a Hawaiian language and culture activist, made explicit the centrality of care to reproductive politics, broadly conceived. She pleaded, put our aina, our land, first. Put us first, the kupa citizens and keiki children of Lahaina, and the cultural practices that breathe ea, or life, into our aina. As all of us, filled with our collective griefs, but also hope for the future, struggle to imagine what it might mean to survive and perhaps even thrive in the Anthropocene, our thinking and organizing around care foregrounds the productive, messy, and necessary relationships between theory and praxis, scholarship and grassroots activism that will continue to animate and enrich the feminist study of reproduction today and in the future. The field has come a long way. As we forge our path for the next 40 years, our thinking and collective action around what it means to care for our human and non-human collectivities will be central to making a more just and generous reproductive worlds. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Roberts, or Liz. I'm a middle-aged white woman, and I have coordinated red glasses, red shirt, and comfortable shoes. I am just so honored to be asked to be on this panel. In the last few years, I haven't been working on the topics that I started out working on that looked very classically like feminist reproductive anthropology, but I feel like all the work I'm doing now, collaborative work on environmental health and environmental engineering, is completely suffused by it, but also has showed me just how deeply reproduction penetrates everything in our daily lives and the daily lives of all the folks that we work with. So with the prompt, how did we come to reproductive politics and feminist anthropology and the combination of that, I thought a bit more about how I even started becoming interested in these topics. And it basically was about growing up and just really being into science fiction. And trying, I think, in college to figure out why I was so drawn to images and films and books and movies that were all about kind of the wondrous and the horrific. And I think later on I was able to look back and think about how so much of science fiction, it sometimes feels like all of it, is really about this incredible fear and rapture around reproductive bodies and their weirdness. And this, especially when you live in a world with an Enlightenment heritage of being very concerned about being individuals and having individual boundaries. So this fascination with bodily boundaries, self-other, what nature and culture is, I think got me to start working in these areas in college, where I did an undergraduate dissertation on surrogacy. And one of the most important books I read in college to help me understand that was Donna Haraway's work in general, but also the Cyborg Manifesto. And reading her work got me fascinated and obsessed with the work of Octavia Butler, and I very much on purpose put here one of the original covers, which were whitewashed. I mean, she wasn't allowed to have African-American images on the covers of her books at that point, and now there's reissues, but this was the image that was on the beginning of her book, Dawn, which that trilogy, the Dawn trilogy, or the Regeneration trilogy, really changed a lot of the way that I think about reproduction in general and the relationship between selves and others that constantly move. And then I went to grad school and I was trying to do similar work and decided I was going to work in Latin America. But right when I started grad school is when this book, Conceiving the New World Order, came out. And I think everyone here is attesting to the importance of this book as well as Faye and Raina's other books, but I just feel like you were saying you need to get another copy. I think I've had several copies and they've all fallen apart. And in grad school, it was just every single chapter meant something and helped shape the way that I was going to go do a feminist politics of reproduction in Ecuador. And I think the other biggest kind of thinker that was helping me understand how strange our own US-based understandings of and experiences of bodies as individual selves was Marilyn Strathern's work. And that really helped. Let's see, is there anything else I missed them? So this, move on from there. Really informed all of the work or all the thinking I did for my first book, God's Laboratory, which was about assisted reproduction in the Andes in Ecuador in specific. But I think also what Marcia just laid out in terms of those first 20 years and all of those ethnographies, that was all sitting there waiting to be read and engaged with as I was able to do my dissertation. So when I finished working on that book and was trying to think about what's next, which is what we're supposed to do when you're on a tenure-track job, I realized that so much of what I had learned in Ecuador was what I wanted to keep working on, which was people were teaching me, people in clinics and outside of clinics, that this sense of an essential nature inside of our bodies and then malleable culture, something I'd always been interested in, they just kind of weren't having it. It didn't mean that things were liberatory or progressive, but there was this constant assumption that race, sex, health conditions, all of these things are constantly shifting. And I really started becoming interested in how can these kinds of experiences and theorizations shape what's going on in anthropology with kind of the rise of epigenetics in the life sciences. And there was this excitement in, I think, medical anthropology about how things like epigenetics and the microbiome were going to potentially create new bridges between what anthropologists have been saying all along and these life scientists. And I was interested in being part of thinking through that. And Raina was actually one of the early people that helped me think about epigenetics as a place to go. And Coming to epigenetics and working now with environmental health researchers for over 10 years and doing collaborative work with them, it feels like all of that is very, very possible. And then also this thing that so many of you all here in this room have documented tends to be true over and over again, where the ways that capitalism, models of nature and culture, and the way funding mechanisms work end up reducing what is possible to understand within individual bodies. And all of the theorization of reproduction that I learned earlier on, and then the work that other people are doing today, have helped me really think about the way that these kinds of images, like this epigenetic modifications, they keep limiting the way that we can understand what moves in and out of bodies and our relationships to the world around us. And hopefully, well, lots of people are rethinking what environment is, but there's all kinds of ways that that's not possible to do or think, especially within NIH-funded mechanisms in the United States. So I've been working for the last 10 years with environmental health scientists and also their exposure scientists in all kinds of ways, and been thinking about models of exposure. And this is all reproduction, of course. It's reproduction over the long term of forms of inequality. And it's also reproduction in terms of learning much more about the daily practices of care that people in highly polluted areas engage in to live with chemicals, alongside chemicals, and to manage their everyday lives. And so Lisa just brought up water. I'll just give a tiny example of that. It's been such a privilege working in collaboration with environmental health folks and engineers to be able to grasp more about the really small-scale infrastructures that people use to store and manage water, to manage water intermittency. And one of the biggest findings we've had is just how much labor women put into managing their household's water allotment that they get in Mexico City. And being able to theorize that as a form of reproduction and reproductive care has been extraordinarily powerful. So last slide. I guess I felt a little strange trying to weigh in on what we should do next, given that I don't feel like I'm as ensconced in reproductive politics in terms of my academic pursuits right now. But I think spending now the last 25 years mostly located in Latin America and Mexico and Ecuador, it seems like one of the things that we're really good at as anthropologists is helping ourselves and the world decenter the United States and the individual liberal subject as the heart of reproduction and the focus of reproductive rights and obligations. And then I would say here, let's do that, except when we can't, because of course, liberal individual subject is incredibly important when we're trying to do certain kinds of work. And I just wanted to say three things that I think are actually all the same thing. So it's been an amazing learning experience about how in Latin America reproductive justice is so often not based on individual choice, but on rights to health and different kinds of obligation to each other. Of course, environmental justice is also kind of a way that we can think reproduction, and so much of it is about assuming permeation instead of assuming that we somehow have a capacity to keep the world out of our bodies. And then I guess the other thing I would say is reproductive justice is earth justice, and that is very much evident working in the field of environmental health at this point. And I guess the last thing I'll say is the kinds of collaborations that I've been working on in the last 10 years with life scientists has been such an education in thinking that I was coming with kind of this feminist approach that was really collective, but learning just how lone wolfy so many of us are in our efforts in anthropology has been kind of eye-opening. Of course, Raina and Faye weren't like that, but I've learned so much about what these collaborative projects are and what's possible with them, and that, of course, is also a form of reproductive care that's intergenerational. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I am Danya Glavo. I come to you from NYU, from the Tandon School of Engineering, NYU is well represented up here today. I am a early middle-aged, very light-skinned woman with brown curly hair. I'm wearing all black shiny shoes, and a very cozy houndstooth jacket. Time. All right, so I just want to kind of address the couple of questions today. I don't have slides, but I want to start with this first question: how did I come to feminist anthropology of reproduction? How does my work contribute to this tradition? So I came via my fieldwork and despite my training. My training was actually not officially in anthropology. My PhD is in science and technology studies. As an example of that, one book that several people have brought up now is Emily Martin's The Woman in the Body. I remember a specific instance of struggle, argument about whether I should read this book for my comps with one of my ultimately 3 dissertation advisors in graduate school. This is a book I keep taking out of the library, putting on my shelf, and returning. I still haven't read it, although I've read almost everything else that Emily Martin has written. So there's some trauma there, certainly still. Some of the people on this stage have really shaped my journey as well. Raina and Emily's Science Studies Writing Group at NYU, seeing Raina and Faye speak as one brain so many times in New York and at AAA conferences. Donna Davis's intervention in my pregnancy at 27 weeks to tell me to stop doing strength training and get a doula. And then ultimately mutually firing my OB after reading her book and objecting to some of the practices of biomedical surveillance of pregnancy. So the people on this stage have had a lot to do with my development as well. Just briefly, my first book, Food Allergy Advocacy, again, thank you, Marcia, for highlighting that, looked at health advocacy through a specifically feminist lens, tracing in particular the stakes and strategies of social reproduction. Once I had this sort of gestalt shift to know that social reproduction was what was interesting there. I saw it everywhere. How people carried themselves, what they wore, their word choices, their tone of voice, their career paths, family structures, and paths not taken, the claims they made upon the state in their activism, their legislative advocacy strategies, and their hopes for the good life for their children. So this book was ultimately a project that tried to dredge up some of the Marxist, socialist, feminist past to see what we could learn from it today in a contemporary ethnographic setting. My second book, Cyborg, does something similar, coming out in February with Laura Furlano, kind of updating cyborg theory, especially Donna Haraway's work for the 21st century in an intersectional feminist paradigm. And then my day job at NYU Tandon is running an STS minor, a growing vertical of student programming around the theme of feminism and STEM, and running a curriculum initiative in engineering ethics. So there I'm graduating 1,200 and growing undergraduate engineers per year who have read a Cyborg Manifesto, a little bit of feminist anthropology, and some critical ethics of technology, and understand some of the structural critique that ought to be part of ethical reasoning. So I think of this sometimes as a feminist social science or feminist anthropology at scale. And then what would I like to see in the field? I would personally love to see more thinking across scale within feminist reproductive anthropology, whether it's studying up or institutional ethnography that claims a forthrightly feminist anthropological positioning. I'm dying to see, for example, the Marxist feminist ethnography of a pharmaceutical company, a project that I can no longer do myself. I think they could find out too much about me with a quick Google search. It wouldn't let me in, but I encourage any graduate students in the room to consider that. I'd love to talk about that. I think one of the strengths of feminist anthropology is that we are careful, right? We care about how we engage with our participants. We're careful about how we connect the particular to the structural, careful to declare what we do not know or what we are not situated to know. Yet with all that care, we are also bold in naming injustice when we see it. So again, I want to know more about how these things operate at scale. within the halls of power. And maybe this is also influenced by being at an engineering school where we do everything at scale and we teach students to do things at scale as well. But that's kind of my number one wish list item. And I would love to think more about that with everyone in the room today. Thank you all so much.
Hello, everybody. I'm Seda Saluk. I'm an assistant professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Michigan. I am a relatively short woman with black curly hair, wearing black clothing. Thank you to Riza and Leah for organizing this roundtable and also inviting me to be part of it. So I will talk about 3 places in different parts of the world that were influential in my journey to feminist anthropology of reproduction, and then reflect on how these places impacted my approach to the field. My journey to feminist anthropology of reproduction started during my undergraduate years at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey, during the early 2000s, where I had the privilege of taking classes from many anti-colonialist feminist scholars such as Nükhet Sirman and Nazan Üstündağ. Some of these scholars, a decade later, were imprisoned, forced to retire, or had to leave the country in exile conditions for criticizing the Turkish state's violence in Turkey's Kurdistan. These scholars created liberatory spaces in and outside the classrooms, or communities of rebellion, as Lorcia Garcia Peña puts it, which gave us the language and tools to understand and discuss the pressing issues that we encounter in our lives and also in Turkey at the time, through the lens of critical anti-colonialist feminisms. Another side of critical knowledge production that was influential in my journey was anti-militarist feminist students' movements on and beyond campus, where we read and discussed works of Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, Jewish feminists in Turkey and the Ottoman past, in conversation with Black feminist thought, and also Palestinian, Arab, and Egyptian feminists in the region. From the early days, reproduction was an important part of our discussions. We were eager to discuss the multiple forms of control over our bodies and sexualities as young women coming from different backgrounds. To talk about access to basic sexual and reproductive health services on and beyond campus, and our complex histories with our own mothers. At the time, we were also observing the unfolding of a decades-long vexing paradox in Turkish politics in real life. So on the one hand, the rise of pronatalist discourses and policies of the government and the glorification of mothering in the media through phrases such as the heaven is under the feet of mothers, and on the other hand, the images of Kurdish peace mothers being dragged on the streets by the police during protests against state violence and forced disappearances of their children. So both the radical potential of mothering and the limits of maternal politics in a selectively pronatalist context were among the topics we constantly discussed during those years. I remained connected to women's and feminist movements in Turkey after graduating, but I moved to Budapest, Hungary, to get my master's degree in gender studies at Central European University, which would also be forced out of the country by the Hungarian government a decade later. There, under the guidance of anthropologist Elisa Helms, who works on women's activism in post-war Bosnia, I wrote a thesis on gender-based projects of supposedly progressive non-governmental organizations based in Turkey. And also at CU, I had the chance to work with faculty and fellow students researching and writing about post-socialist context. So it was an enriching experience and introduced me to many generative dialogues between post-colonial and post-socialist feminisms. After getting my master's degree, I moved to Western Massachusetts, to United States, to get a doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a place that turned out to be the perfect place to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. At UMass Amherst and the Fife College area, I had the chance to work with inspiring feminist anthropologists and historians, such as Jackie Urla, Laura Briggs, Lynn Morgan, but I also learned a lot from my fellow graduate students, Latin American and decolonial feminist anthropologists of reproduction, Julieta Chaparro, Castriela Hernandez-Reyes, Vanessa Giraldo, and Ana Del Conde. So whose fierce commitment to historical contextualization, situated and embodied knowledges, and social justice has been inspirational since the beginning. Our discussions, both in and outside the classroom, were my formal entry into the feminist anthropology of reproduction. And in conversation with scholarship from our own regions, we read and discussed feminist anthropologists based in North America, with some of whom I have the honor of sitting in this roundtable today. So I want to conclude my remarks by emphasizing not transformations, but common threads that I find important in the field over the years that inspired and informed me both politically and analytically. Feminist anthropology of reproduction has always been about analyzing power and difference from a critical, intersectional feminist lens, about commitment to both thick description and historicization, about stressing how gender is racialized, how racialization happens through gender, and how gender and race are mutually foundational and constitutive analytical categories when talking about reproduction. Reproductive politics are never about just reproduction, while at the same time, all politics are reproductive politics, as historian Laura Briggs puts it. Feminist anthropology of reproduction is also about starting our research questions from our own experiences and our own communities, or communities that we deeply care about, although there is also value in working with groups, what Sarah Harding calls repugnant others, people whose behavior or politics we might find reprehensible, especially in our current times. A necessary direction for advancing the field for me as a feminist scholar from the global south is to put reproduction and reproductive politics in transnational context. So this is partly to fight against the mainstream tendency to exceptionalize our research context, but I think today it is also important more than ever to emphasize how reproduction and reproductive politics in our respective field size stem from long-standing social, political, and economic conditions, both domestically and globally, and are inextricably linked to each other. Also, to reflect on the different stakes and consequences of knowledge production for feminist scholars of reproduction in different parts of the world, in different institutions, and in different ranks. So I will stop here, but I'm looking forward to discussing these issues with you all today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Great. My name is Elise Singer. When Risa asked for our slides, I had a limited moment between classes, so excuse the large picture of my face. It was the image that was most readily available. I am a 30-something white, fairly short woman with red hair. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you to Risa and Leah for organizing this amazing panel, and to all of these tremendous panelists and audience members for your comments. I came to the anthropology of reproduction as a college student at Bard College in upstate New York. It was in a feminist anthropology class taught by someone who continues to be a dear friend, Megan Callahan, in which I first read several of the books that we saw on the slide in Marcia's comments earlier. We were reading the works of Faye Ginsburg and Raina Rapp, Marcia herself, and several others. I got interested in abortion specifically later on while working as an abortion counselor in a small independent clinic in Granite City, Illinois, featured on the slide here. And this was across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri, where I was attending graduate school and encountering scholars of reproduction like Carolyn Sargent and others. When I worked as an abortion counselor, the staff with whom I worked regularly talked to me well into the evening about what things had been like in the aftermath of Roe versus Wade. This clinic opened just 1 year after Roe was passed in 1973, and so some of these staff members had been there for decades. They described in great detail clinic bombings, kidnappings of abortion doctors, and the like, and it was impossible not to recognize the stakes of this issue, which of course I had read about in work like Faye Ginsburg's back in a classroom setting. And I had noticed when Mexico City legalized abortion in 2007, ushering in what some feminist scholars and advocates were describing as a new moment for the construction of women's citizenship. And this is how I eventually went to go do doctoral research on this topic. I wanted to understand how women, abortion providers, and everyday people were making sense of this new moment, their new reproductive rights, and also what was a new aspect of public health care in the Mexican capital. And of course, the work of Lynn Morgan and Liz Roberts on reproductive governance was foundational in sifting through the role of the Catholic Church and the Mexican state in governing and regulating reproduction in the Mexican context. When I began that work and started flying to Mexico about 10 years ago now, I never could have imagined that abortion rights would no longer exist in my home country by the time the project came to a close. This issue of illegal abortion had been one that was relegated to my field site. My book came out just 1 month before Roe was overturned in June of 2022. And in my reproductive politics class at the University of Oklahoma the following spring, together with students, we digested what was happening all around us. Oklahoma's 4 abortion clinics shuttered immediately after Dobbs, and Oklahoma law enforcement was empowered to prosecute anyone who had procured an abortion or facilitated it. University administration instructed us, the couple of us actually who teach and write on these topics, that we're not allowed to instruct a student who reveals that they are pregnant and in need of an abortion on how to circumvent state laws and get one, lest we be accused of aiding and abetting an abortion, which can face legal backlash, not to mention potential job loss. We were living in a state, and I still am, that is home to the country's most pro-life governor, Kevin Stitt. That's a self-described phrase he uses for himself. And I remember in class that spring, one student asked if abortions procured before Dobbs could be retroactively prosecuted, worry etched on her face. Absolutely not, I responded, compelled to soften her fear. But the question hung in the air like a ghost. None of us in the class that day could say for sure. And what I didn't tell the students in class that spring was that right before the semester started, I had to leave the state suddenly to seek an abortion. I had loaded the syllabus that spring with readings on the politics and history of abortion, but I couldn't think or talk, let alone teach about these topics without panicking. So I'm buoyed today by the incredible scholarship and advocacy that's continued to emerge in the aftermath of Dobbs, and the feminist abortion care networks that are springing up all over this country and that have of course existed in Latin America and other countries for years and years, who have long had to grapple with this criminalized landscape. And I look forward to this conversation today to figure out what we might do as scholars and activists and advocates, not just with regard to precarious abortion rights, but to all aspects of reproductive politics. So thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Leah Tarragon-Zeller. I have long curly hair and a beret. I must admit that I came to reproduction studies by accident, or as we anthropologists like to say, via experiences in the field. While conducting ethnographic fieldwork in Jerusalem, I overheard a conversation that would truly change the course of my research. At the time, I was conducting fieldwork at a Beis Yaakov seminary, the flagship education system of Haredi Judaism, a religious minority often called ultra-Orthodox Jews. One day, a young student got engaged, and I overheard two friends chatting on a bench outside. "I can't believe she's going to be the first one to become a mother." The other girl laughed and replied, "Who knows? She might decide to wait." I was taken by surprise by what I heard. Not only were these two girls speaking about contraception, a topic that is considered taboo in their community, I was surprised to hear that delaying a pregnancy was even thinkable at their life stage. In a community where families have 6 to 7 children and are expected to have a child within 1 year of marriage, I wondered what conditions were enabling these young Haredi girls to speak about contraception. While I was familiar with anthropology of religion, I realized that I needed to immerse myself in ethnographies of reproduction. So I read many of those that Marcia put on her slides before, and so many others, including her own. Today, I want to reflect on 3 things that caught my attention then, 3 things that inform my own work and are very relevant to the future conversations about reproduction. First, I noticed that ethnographies of reproduction, especially in the Middle East, have largely focused on assisted reproduction, which reifies an image of couples pursuing what Marcia Inhorn calls quests for conception. And while this work challenges assumptions about gender and the inflexibility of religious law, it also reinforces expectations to make families. But this is not the only reproductive technology that people grapple with. By analyzing contraception in my own work, I make the case for considering different coexisting desires around family formation. My work explores not just proceptive, but also contraceptive desires around family formation. When to have children, how many, and at what cost. I'm concerned with the ways contraception, along with other types of low-tech areas of medicine, have often been pushed aside in reproduction studies. But family planning is a site for negotiating significant social concepts, such as femininity, masculinity, culture, modernity, nationalism, and race. As anthropologist Rhoda Kanane puts it, family planning is now part of the social processes in which these concepts are daily defined, changed, and redefined in people's lives, in which gender is configured, communities are imagined, and boundaries of the modern are drawn. A reproductive lens on contraception pushed me to think about the ways this religious minority I was studying, whose high fertility rates are often perceived as age-old and set-in-stone practices, were actually made and remade through Israeli pronatalist policies that were reshaping the reproductive infrastructure they lived in. It took me a while to realize that the conversations I overheard about contraception were due to drastic changes in Israeli child benefits that were part of a capitalist reform led by Israeli policymakers who desired to reproduce a particular vision of a Jewish state. Their attempt to manage the rapid growth of this Haredi minority was harmful, as 45% were already under the poverty line and were especially vulnerable to these deep cutbacks in child allowances, opening up a new front in Israel's stratified and racial reproductive politics. Feminist scholars have repeatedly shown how contraception is often used as a vehicle for biopolitics, and thus closely linked to projects of political governance, as neoliberal desires to cultivate a high-income and high-tech nation merge with particular Jewish demographic anxieties. My new book, The State of Desire, Religion and Reproductive Politics in the Promised Land, shows how these policies are reshaping the reproductive desires of Orthodox Jews, and I try to highlight the painful cracks that emerge in large family ideals and their own lived realities amidst shrinking public support, feminism, and new ideals of romance. Torn between conflicting desires, they craft particular ethical choreographies through which technical, scientific, gender, political, financial, and theological sensitive, which I call repro-theologies, are all coordinated. In light of this work, I realized that we need a more nuanced understanding of how people engage with contraception. For example, my work challenges the common dichotomies between planned and unplanned children, and it advances the work of other scholars who have pointed to the inadequacy of rational choice models that overly focus on intentionality and planning, as well as the very unhelpful binary language we use to discuss reproductive decision-making. Amid a global ecological disaster, grasping a better understanding of how people make reproductive decisions seems more urgent than ever. So 2 final reflections. First, there are many risks in studying a conservative religious group whose desires and politics vastly differ from one's own. My ethics and my politics are guided by feminist scholars such as Zorita Vishai, Rachel and Rachel Ronaldo, who have argued that studying conservative contexts, quote, unlocks the door to a type of social theory that considers transnational connections and local contexts, investigating rather than imposing theoretical narratives. I follow their call by carefully documenting individual interests while also situating these in the troubling politics they are embedded in. Documenting these experiences is critical for broadening our horizons, as well as offering new pathways to understand the different perceptions of reproduction in conservative politics today. In doing so, I also propose new links between theology, politics, and feminist anthropology. Finally, religion is often sidelined in studies of reproductive politics, and in the last few years, there has been a renewed interest in showcasing how religion, race, and reproductive politics are deeply intertwined through questions of righteousness and nationalist dreams of the future. Reproductive logics has also ushered in Israel's most extreme and right-wing government, and I am immersed in following these dynamics together with my students, and I really look forward to the works of the next generation to continue studying these dynamics now more than ever. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you so much to Kyle and Keisha for interpreting. My name is Risa. Although I've been called a young scholar, I am firmly middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length brown hair wearing all black. And my pronouns are she, her. I came to feminism in an unexpected place, in Sister Maureen Hilliard's religious studies classes at my all-girl Catholic high school. The farther I find myself from her classroom, and it's far, the more I understand the many ways that she taught me how to appreciate figures of nuance and perceived contradiction like a feminist nun, and as well as to cultivate creative practices for working within constraining conditions toward an otherwise. The seeds that Sister Maureen planted in me took root as a young adult, as a women's studies major in college, and active in campus and community organizing. In fact, it was community organizing for abortion rights in the context of George W. Bush's administration that propelled me into anthropology. I understood the political utility of simple stories about abortion to move voters and policymakers, but I struggled with how those stories flattened out the identities, the feelings, and the experiences of people that I spent time with as a doula during their abortions. And I found that feminist anthropologists offer the most compelling insights about the intimate and the transcendent dimensions of reproductive politics, and they did so without reproducing two simple stories. So my first book, Conceiving Christian America, is a love letter to my feminist teachers, who we could all agree are also doulas. It examines how the U.S. Christian right strategically interfaces with assisted reproduction through the practice of embryo adoption. Embryo adoption is an assisted family-making practice that brings to the donation of unused IVF embryos for procreation, the rituals and rhetoric of adoption, as well as the tactics used in anti-abortion advocacy. It was a practice founded and promoted by white pro-life evangelicals, focused on saving embryos that they contend are unborn children deserving of families and futures. And it occupies a very small corner of the U.S. fertility services, but its promoters had played an outsized role in conservative U.S. politics, including the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so this book builds on and adds to feminist scholarship of right-wing movements by tracing how the U.S. Christian right enrolls a range of reproductive politics, from ARTs and infertility to adoption and abortion, in advancing Christian nationalist ambitions. And ethnographic research in particular was useful in bringing the Christian rights political playbook into relief, especially the discourse of white saviorism that is often used to foment moral panic around a particular figure, in this case, the IVF embryo, framed as socially valuable, vulnerable, and worthy of protection. Ethnography showed how white saviorism's do-gooding veneer masks how it actually works by fear-mongering, reproducing hierarchical ideas about social worth, and moralizing and masking power grabs. And so I draw on feminist scholars of saving, from Lila Bulugad to Donna Ayin Davis, to make a renewed case for being wary of saviorism in all its forms. Ethnography also revealed how religious right-wing politics proliferate reproductive proxies. So this book shows how embryo adoption serves as a strategic stand-in for the U.S. anti-abortion movement. And this is noteworthy because embryo adoption does not intersect directly with abortion care, nor is pregnancy, which is the common focus of anti-abortion activism, required to advance the movement's absolutist ideas about embryo personhood. Anti-abortion agendas are advancing far beyond arenas conventionally associated with abortion care, and this book argues for tracing the reproductive politics of right-wing movements in far-flung places to see reproduction everywhere, in all the places that it penetrates, to use Liz's fruitful word. Such research could usefully inform global feminist solidarities for strategizing ways of resisting efforts to undermine reproductive justice around the world. So we need more feminist ethnographic research on neo-fascist and right-wing movements. And one response to that is the Reproductive Righteousness Project, which I co-lead with Leah and Sarah Franklin and collaborate with a few on this panel, including Seda, Marcia, and Faye. And what we're doing is using nationally specific cases to theorize the elemental role of reproductive politics in right-wing movements worldwide. And something that we're finding is that saviorist rhetoric about nations under threat and their demographic anxieties rooted in homophobia, xenophobia, and racism are common across many cases. Studying right-wing movements, as Faye Ginsburg has written about in her work on pro-life politics, carries ethical and political risk. It involves giving airtime to the words and the worlds that we likely do not embrace, and our research may be used to advance regressive causes. And yet, feminist anthropology is well suited to support such scholarship because I agree with Danya that we have a lot of care. We're careful. Susan Harding describes her approach, studying Christian fundamentalists in the 1980s, as opening up, a process involved in coming from a situated, implicated, and self-reflexive place to support nuanced, complicated, partial, and local readings. To use Marcia's words, this is what we do. In my own experience of opening up to embryo adoption advocates, I felt a renewed commitment to feminist critique that is powerfully aware of the harms of too simple stories, even of political foes. And I'm going to end by amplifying Lilith Mahmoud's view that there is also a need for more studies of liberalism and its complicity with white supremacy. So our anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, decolonial, and abolitionist feminisms are, to use a saviorist term, at risk if we do not heed this important call to interrogate liberal and progressive politics too. So my hope is that wariness of expressions of white saviorism across political spectrums and the attunement to reproductive proxies that propel them may offer some fruitful directions for such work. Thank you.
So we're still Raina and Faye, and I think I'm going to grab the editorial we to say we're a bit overwhelmed as well as deeply appreciative of the presentations that we've all just heard. We wanted to continue the story of our quest for understanding the politics of reproduction where we left off, roughly in the 1990s, and with the birth certainly of Samantha, and then later a diagnosis for my second kid, Teo. In 1999, our essay entitled Fetal Reflections, Confessions of Two Feminist Anthropologists as Mutual Informants highlighted our growing concern that understanding the implications of a diagnosis of a potentially disabling condition was thoroughly segregated from pregnant people's reproductive decision-making about prenatal testing. How, we wondered, could potential parents possibly make an informed decision about whether to continue a pregnancy after receiving a positive diagnosis? Those are quote marks around it. The euphemistically named medical term used when something anomalous shows up in the test. We wondered how an informed decision could be made in the absence of any reality-based understanding of what it means to live with a family member with a body-mind impairment. We began to write about these distinct discursive arenas as siloed social funds of knowledge, segregating genetic diagnoses, reproduction, and disability expertise. These, we insisted, must be considered together. As we wrote and taught about the consequences of that segregation of knowledge, we discovered that disability awareness and the practice of genetic testing were rarely brought into the same conversation, even as recognition of both escalated in public culture. Ethical reflections in the realm of biomedicine, we found, lagged far behind, obscured in events like the signing of routine consent forms, where issues of the inclusion and exclusion of diverse body minds were much too readily silenced.
We invented a term, the doubled telos of modernity. We know this is not going to catch on like stratified reproduction, but that's our term, to describe the tensions between these two powerful but contradictory aspects of contemporary life. On the one hand, biomedical progress, particularly around assistive reproductive technologies, continues to hold out the deeply American neo-eugenic promise of perfectibility, given that fetuses found to have anomalies through prenatal testing are far less likely to be brought to term. On the other hand, the rise of the disability rights and justice movement has created a robust ethical and political framework for democratic inclusion across the full range of human variability. Increasingly, we understood that these different and seemingly conflicting imperatives, or telos, were reshaping life in the 21st century, but that their connections are too rarely recognized. In our forthcoming book, Disability Worlds, we address one of the particularly important challenges to eugenic thinking emerging from feminist disability advocates, writers, and scholars: the prejudicial treatment of pregnant disabled people. Those with disabilities still encounter the widely held belief that they cannot perform motherhood competently. Disabled sociologist Angela Frederick shows how mothers with disabilities are under particular surveillance, considered by many in the medical establishment to be, in quotes, risky mothers, unquote, subject to what she calls the normalcy project. Many pregnant disabled women are encouraged to pursue genetic testing and the possibility of abortion by disability-averse medical professionals who don't have that social fund of knowledge that Raina had just mentioned. Non-normative mothers, including women of color, poor mothers, queer mothers, and those with disabilities, come under particular scrutiny as they are systematically defined as risky and inadequate for mothering.
As disabled journalist Sonia Sharp writes, women with disabilities, quote, now get pregnant and give birth at the same rate as non-disabled ones, unquote. However, most obstetricians know little about them, and they are not pictured on Pampers or Enfamil cartons or counted in maternity statistics. Yet for disabled women, that norm is often treated as aberrant. Provider fear is just one of several barriers that disrupt and delay maternity care for disabled women. Medical racism shapes cares for many because a disproportionate number of younger disabled women are Black and Indigenous. In short, as Sharp argues, quote, by virtually every measure, modern medicine has turned its back on these women, despite the fact that pregnancy is one of the most statistically normal, non-biomedical events that someone with a uterus can experience. We include Fredericks and Sharp's work in our roundtable in order to bring the idea of cripping reproduction into this discussion that already embraces such a wide range of reproductive experiences. This phrase, cripping reproduction, should remind us all that long neo-eugenic shadows continue to haunt the politics of reproduction. We look forward to future and more inclusive discussions across the generations and around the globe in which disability is part of the conversation. Thank you.
Well, I hope everyone has had the same transformative experience that our panelists describe of coming to see everything as reproduction. It is everywhere. And with such great appreciation for the care and collaboration that has informed their work and journey, as well as the courage it takes to theorize through their own experiences. So thank you for everyone. We are short on time for questions, but we want to prioritize yours. So there's a microphone there. So please, we invite you to come up and ask us any questions. We also welcome questions between and among panelists. There's a lot here, and we don't have too much time. Do you have a question? There, thank you, Sarah.
Well, very clearly the first thing to say is thank you so much for such an incredible panel. Which really shows us that the study of reproduction isn't just about a what, it's about the how. And you've totally shown us how to do it. So thank you so much. I mean, massive respect for the organizing of the panel, but also for all the legacies that come together on the stage. So I did just want to maybe pick up on the final points that Raina was making about disability, Faye and Raina together, because it does bring us immediately to the question of infrastructure. What do infrastructures reproduce? What do they select? What do they not? And disability is such an important area for looking at that, because it's literally access to the room, access to the ability to even talk about it. So I just wonder, is that a concept maybe to other people as well that we might want to think about using more? Is infrastructure, reproductive technology, are all infrastructures reproductive technology? Maybe that's a cliche, but at another level it seems very relevant. So maybe that's just a question to start us off. Yeah, thanks.
Is this on? Yeah. That's exactly what I was talking about with scale, right? So yes, I would love to see that. Yeah. So the other thing I'll say is there are very good reasons that feminists look at the particular and the individual lives, and they overlap with the reasons that anthropologists do that. But yes, right? And we can think about the particularities of infrastructure, just as we think about the particularities of a particular practice or clinic or community as well. And I think that matters. And that is maybe where anthropology is distinct from, say, sociology. So yes, I think so.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing up infrastructure, Sarah. The work that I've been doing in the last few years around water intermittency and small-scale water infrastructures in households has taught me a lot about infrastructure and seeing infrastructure and the way that is so reproductive in terms of the ways that people can live their daily lives. And then if this was last year, I'd be here on a scooter, which is what I needed to use for the last few years to get around. And that was one of these, of course, moments where you realize just how specific infrastructures are. So I spent a lot of time this last summer moving around Northern Europe on a scooter, feeling how less accessible it was than the US because we're so able to access individual private cars here, which again connects us to feeling like we're individuals. And being on a scooter with luggage in Northern Europe, where everyone expected I would take public transportation, ended up making me feel not capable of doing what I needed to do in all kinds of really interesting ways. So thank you for the infrastructure question.
I just want to add a plug for the future of reproduction and its books about an infrastructural book that has not yet appeared, and that would be one about the implications of global IVF that Sarah and Marcia have edited and will be out, I guess, in a year or so from NYU Press, in which the question of an infrastructural platform, how it localizes across whatever, 16 or 18 different countries, and what it means in different contexts, all of which have been the kind of, gathering practices that have been discussed on this panel, are really worked out ethnographically in all case study after case study. So look forward, stay tuned, more infrastructural reproduction is on its way.
And thank you, Raina, for being an incredible reviewer of the book.
Sorry about the plug.
Yeah, I also just wanted to speak to the lack of reproductive mental health infrastructure in the US. I mean, we're thinking about basic things like education, housing, transportation, food access. Those are all structural issues, barriers to reproductive mental health. But also there's only 3 inpatient perinatal mental health facilities in this country. When it comes to outpatient services, there's a lot of barriers with insurance. I was told to just go to the ER. I couldn't attend the Motherhood Center in New York because I didn't have private insurance. And then there's also the systemic infrastructure of the family regulation system, where if you're calling 911, you're asking for help, you suddenly have to deal with child protective services, and then you're dealing with the foster care system. So there's a lot with infrastructure with reproductive mental health as well.
Hi, everyone. Thanks you for taking my question. My name is Elizabeth Balaza. My question kind of builds on the same theme in my work autoethnographically, but also in working with birthing people across a variety of geolocations and social positions, has involved thinking about the turning away from institution and the movements in avoiding the institutional oppressions folks walk into as soon as they walk into the doors of a care setting. And so I'm curious, in terms of thinking about scale and how we actually transnationally engage in the ways that maternal and health care, reproductive health care are by definition institutionalized. I'm curious about your thoughts about the movement out of institution by communities.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the question. So I don't think that the institutions that we often enter into are necessarily care institutions. They are capitalist institutions. They are income generating. And so I just want to move away from talking about hospitals in that way. And that is not to say, and I've always have to say this, I am not opposed to hospitals. I'm not opposed to medical professionals. What I am opposed to are the ways in which quality improvement and quality improvement processes influence the kind of decisions that get made about people's health care, and that we need to be thinking more along the lines of not sort of individual medical professionals that I think they're just sort of low-hanging fruit. I think it's really at the quality improvement and quality implementation level that we need to be considering. But also, I don't know if we can simultaneously let things burn, like Ryan Jobson suggests, and rethink and otherwise. But that's sort of where I am around institutions. I do think that there's a process of, or that we need to think about other ways in which care actually gets provided. So I'm a tremendous fan of, around maternal issues, home births, for example, community-based processes for taking care of people, doing, engaging in, like monthly checks or whatever it is people need. And also thinking about the ways that not being in institutionalized settings may reduce some of the kind of racist, transphobic experiences that people have. And in that regard, communities of care, I think, are a really important model to really lift up. So that's where I am with that.
And I think this kind of speaks to my question. I think the question is not so much like, or the issue is not so much that people are removing themselves from institutions. They may be removing themselves from normative capitalist-driven biomedical institutions, but I think they are probably, people are not going through pregnancy in a vacuum, even if they're choosing not to seek biomedical care, right? They're joining Facebook groups, they're joining Reddit groups, right? They're seeking out other people through infrastructures of faith groups, of political groups. So again, I think the question, oh shoot, there goes my water. So there's a question of what is being, no, it's fine, I'll get it later. There's a question of like what is being substituted, right? So the ethnographic project might not be an ethnography of a hospital or a biomedical practice. It might actually be an ethnography of Reddit moderator strategies in real time, right? So that's another way to think about scale and infrastructure, I think, what is the infrastructure at stake? That again.
I'm so glad you brought up Reddit. I spend time on Reddit on Our Abortion, which provides support to online global abortion seekers. So this question about institutions raised for me this curiosity of what in, I think, public health and health policy spaces are called health at the margins, which I think is an odd construction. But I would think self-managing, people who self-manage their abortions are operating all over the world in what are called institutional margins of classic, I guess, providers of health. Caveat that we don't need to call it care. But thinking also about when Reddit goes down, we have a hard day being able to respond to the hundreds of thousands of posts that are provided and monitored only by unpaid volunteers to provide accurate information in a world with so much mis and disinformation. To try to get people to the information that's supportive is the challenge. So I think also about information, not least which are data infrastructures and platforms, but also just information as a major part of what makes institutions, as well as the margins, possible spaces to be well when our institutions, including our legal systems and our governance, fails us.
Can I just add one thing? Because I think what you said is so important, but I also want us to remember that not every place has access to Reddit, right? Like, I just want to remind us of that. Like when I've done work in Namibia, things are just gone down, right? And so how do we create models of connection, keeping those things in mind?
Thank you so much, Donna. I want to also say we really have to finish, but thinking about access and thinking about infrastructure and all of these things, I want to remind us that methods matter as well. And we study very different contexts all over with different access points and different mediators towards both the personal, the political, et cetera. So I think this is also an invitation to think not only about how we think, but how we do our work as scholars of reproduction. And I want to thank us, even though we want to be in this conversation for a long time. Did you want to say something? No. Oh, so go and then.
Sorry. One last thing. I've been grappling with the same question as well as feminist scholars, how we are going to engage with institutions while at the same time criticizing them, but also demanding the care and resources. And I kind of take inspiration from Kurdish feminists who are building their stateless societies, but also very much still engaging with institutions, the parliament, the hospitals, and also my own experience as kind of an immigrant, pregnant person in the US when I had my, child. And the first time I was contacted was like months after on Zoom. So it's, I think these are important questions, as feminist scholars, how we are going to engage with institutions, but also demand the things that they are supposed to provide? Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Seda. I want to thank everybody for this truly intergenerational conversation. I don't think that every field in anthropology feels the way we feel here today. And I appreciate all the doulas for creating the conditions, for these conversations. And I thank you all.